So hello, everyone, and welcome to another conversation of the fourth cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. My name is Maria da Piedade Ferreira, and today I am very glad to introduce you to Juhani Pallasmaa. Juhani Pallasmaa, architect, professor emeritus, writer from Helsinki. His design work in 1983 to 22 through his office in Helsinki as well. Rector of the Institute of Industrial Design, Director of the Museum of Finnish Architecture, Professor and Dean of the Faculty of Architecture at the Helsinki University of Technology. Juhani Pallasmaa held several visiting professorships in the USA, teaching and lecturing in numerous universities in Europe, North and South America, Africa, Asia, and Australia. Member of the Pritzker Architecture Prize jury from 2008 to 2014, Juhani Pallasmaa has published 70 books and 800 essays and prefaces, writings translated in 36 languages. His books include The Embodied Image, The Thinking Hand, The Architecture of Image, Existential Space in Cinema, and The Eyes of the Skin. He is honorary member of SAFA, AIA, and RIBA, and has received 6 honorary doctorates and numerous Finnish and international awards. Juhani, I am so incredibly honored to have you here with our class and our guests today.
Thank you.
So you should be...
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. I'm speaking in Helsinki, and it's terribly dark here. The autumn has already fallen on us. As I agreed yesterday with Maria, I have prepared a 20-minute introduction to the subject matter of corporeal architecture before our conversation. And I have given my talk the title, The Embodied and Existential Essence of Architecture. Architecture is usually seen as a visual art form, and this assumption has also guided and limited the development of its theory, education, practice, and critique. We live in the age of fabricated and mass-produced images. Italo Calvino, the great Italian writer, called this situation, quote, the rainfall of images, unquote. The visual understanding of architecture has neglected and often deliberately rejected the multisensory, embodied, and interactive essence of this art form. However, buildings and towns are not just settings to be enjoyed by the eye. They are true extensions of our senses, bodies, minds, memories, and imaginations. We exist and live in embodied images. We do not just observe them optically, we internalize them. The evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins suggests that the constructions of animals, such as the beaver's water regulation systems or bird nests, should be included in the definition of the species in question. It is even more evident that our constructions, material, mental, and spiritual, should be seen as extensions of ourselves, without which we could not live the kind of lives we do. We project and extend ourselves to our life settings, as well as our realms of imagination and eventually to the world and beyond. Quote, "We touch the sun and the stars with our eyes," Maurice Merleau-Ponty suggests. At the same time, we internalize the world, including the imaginary worlds of dreams and arts. My favorite philosopher, Merleau-Ponty, has a significant and beautiful idea about the relation of artistic works to the realities of the world. He writes, quote, "We come to see not the work of art, but the world according to it," unquote. This idea of fundamental and unavoidable relatedness of art applies fully in architecture, especially because buildings also direct and organize the activities of our lives. The essence of architecture is not the building as a material and aestheticized object, but as complex web of relatedness with our perceptual and experiential world. Architecture is not only perceived as it enters in and guides our acts and behaviors. We tend to think of architecture as a material object, a noun, to use a linguistic notion, but it is actually a verb which enters concretely our actions, perceptions, and emotions. A window placed precisely in relation to the context of the building makes us see the apple tree in the garden or the distant mountaintop. We can even say that the building has pre-experienced and evaluated the surrounding landscape before we experience it. Architecture relates us with the site and its geology, biology, landscape, and existing built structures, other societal groups and individuals, cultural structures, histories, beliefs, myths, and ceremonies. When we grasp this deep, complex, and endless network of relations, we begin to understand that this field of interactions cannot be an exclusively visual entity and a result of mere visual aesthetics. Even vision itself relies on interactions. We touch, hear, smell, weigh, and measure through eyes, and our entire body and its fantastically integrated systems. In powerful architectural experiences, our entire existence, including our emotive and intestinal realms, is activated. Powerful experiences of architecture even make us have strong feelings in our stomach, or even to weep. As I visit Michelangelo's Biblioteca Laurentiana in Florence, or Sigurd Leverent's St. Peter's Church near Malmö in Sweden, I have tears in my eyes. The astronauts speak of the power of the oversight, the view of the Earth from outer space, when the entire planet is seen at one site. The astronauts report on a distinct sense of melancholy and the tendency to weep. These are tears of melancholia, a deep acknowledgement of human solitude. Confronting a masterwork in art or architecture seems to offer a similar overview into human life. My 2 visits at the Karnak temple in Egypt made me momentarily lose my balance and sense of self, while the Ryoanji Zen garden in Kyoto cleared and purified my mind of rational thoughts. We need to add the dimensions of memory, unconscious, imagination, and dream to the true landscape of architecture. I repeat, architecture and artistic expressions need to be relational. It points at something outside itself and beyond its physical limits. To the sensory appreciation of architecture, we need to add the dimensions of memory, unconscious, imagination, and dreaming, and all of these realms are constantly mixed. This is the thick and layered density of human existence, and I believe that we cannot encounter through any single sense alone. We have to confront architecture and art through our existential sense, through existing in the same experiential reality. Quote, the flesh of the world, unquote, to use a powerful notion of Merleau-Ponty, the corporeality of art and architecture is strongly comes through this Merleau-Ponty's notion, the flesh of the world. Italo Calvino writes touchingly about the ethical task of literature, but the writer's view is directly applicable in architecture. Quote, in an age when other fantastically speedy, widespread media are triumphing and running the risk of flattening all communication onto a single homogeneous surface, the function of literature is to communicate between things that are different, simply because they are different, not blunting, but even sharpening the differences between them, following the true bent of written language. End of Calvino quote. In these Calvino lines, the word literature could well be changed to architecture. Quote, the painter takes his body with him. Indeed, we cannot imagine how a mind could paint, unquote, the poet Paul Valéry writes. It is even more impossible to think of bodiless mind conceiving architecture. Human mind and body, intelligence and metabolic functions are not exclusive opposites, as they are absolutely interlocked projections of human existence. Permit me to refer here to my 3 books, The Eyes of the Skin, Architecture and the Senses. the thinking hand, the embodied and existential wisdom in architecture, and the third one, the embodied image, embodied image and imagination in architecture. These books intend to open up the existential perspective to architecture beyond vision, not through theoretical and intellectual constructions, but through my 65 years of practicing architecture, design, and visual arts, reading and conversing endlessly with countless friends of different backgrounds, from the world of arts to that of philosophy and the sciences. I do not aim at proposing theories. My intention is to mediate lived personal experiences. I'll end my prologue to our conversation with another quote from Calvino. I suggest that you change the word literature to architecture. Quote, my confidence in the future of architecture, my confidence in the future of literature consists in the knowledge that there are things that only literature can give us by means specific to it. Only if poets and writers set themselves tasks that no one else dares imagine will literature continue to have a function. So think of this Calvino chapter, Calvino piece by using the word architecture there. Well, this was my prepared part of the conversation. Sorry, I forgot to turn off my mobile phone and it started to ring.
It was from you. No problem. No problem. Thank you so much for preparing, especially this wonderful text for us. And it's always so inspiring to listen to your ideas. And I had the honor also of meeting you in person last summer, and I have read all your books, which have also continuously inspired. And I remember the first time that I read The Eyes of the Skin, it was in a time around the middle of my architecture studies that I was overworked like all architecture students. I had wrist problems because of working too much with the computer, all these things that we now accept as normal because that's what the computer does to us. And I started to practice yoga and other disciplines of connecting to the body. And I read your book around the same time. And this was really something that sparked the whole idea that I have been developing now for almost 15 years with this project of corporeal architecture. So it's really, really very meaningful to have this conversation today. And in your text, in your prologue, I also had to think many times about how our memories, our embodied memory, really is an archive of all the experiences we have with all the objects and the buildings that we interact with, and how it shapes us. And sometimes we might have an encounter with someone who works in a very stressful office, for example, or where public administration happens, or in a hospital and so on, and we might say this person was so unkind and these people are always so stressful, and we might not think that the building and the office where they work maybe is even shaping their character, because of course it conditions all their habits, it patterns their habits, their movements, all of these things. And very often here in Germany, where the influence of functionalism is so present and so strong, I often feel this, that the buildings and the cities and all of this are always pushing us to be very fast and very efficient, and we can't waste any time. So Juhani, I wanted to ask you, when was the moment also in your career as an architect and also someone who studies in so many different disciplines, when was the moment that you realized that architecture had gotten so distant from the body?
Well, I began to study architecture in 1957. And that was the time through the 60s of a great excitement in the possibilities of modernity. For instance, the science of futurology emerged in the 60s, which expresses the perspective, long perspective that we had in those years. I was educated in a rationalist manner by very fine teachers, and I believed and worked in a rationalist manner. But then in 1972 to 74, I taught in Addis Ababa at the university. I taught architecture. And those 2+ years completely changed my thinking. I became critical and doubtful about technology, about rationality when separated from our other dimensions. And also I lost my confidence in universality of human values and habits and beliefs. So my answer would be, it was the African situation and experience that changed me. And after that, I have become, I would say almost every year, more conscious of the role of the body, the integrated body, which is a huge, as I said in the beginning, a hugely complex thing. And I have come to the conclusion finally a couple of years ago that the most important sense in architecture is none of the 5 Aristotelian senses. The most important sense is our existential sense, our sense of being and our sense of ourselves. Those are most central in architecture. In an architectural experience, I do not look at a building or a room. My being is in interaction with the building or the space.
Yes, and I would like to pick up here with the topic of architecture also as art or in connection to the arts. And of course, this could be a long discussion, and also it can also be seen as a controversial statement because many people really don't think that architecture is an art or that these fields should be separated. But I know, Juhani, that you also don't believe in this separation between architecture and art. So I would also like to ask you.
What did you say? I believe in that separation.
No, you do not believe.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to make sure.
No, we have to make this clear. That's also why I feel so connected to your work, because when I was a student of architecture, I had two very strict professors who told me, they saw my drawings and they found them too expressive. And they told me, you know, you should go and study fine arts because architecture has nothing to do with this. It has nothing to do with art or emotion or feeling. And I was always very stubborn, and I thought, no, I don't think so. And I had for Christmas a book that my parents gave me as a present, and it was about the architecture of Stephen Hall. And the project he did for Finland with the chiasma and all of this, all of his beautiful aquarello. So I thought, no, I think that there are architects who are working also with an artistic perspective. So I would like to ask you, also with your knowledge, because you have much more experience with different schools of architecture and also with architects on a very high level, why is there a rift? Why is it accepted, this rift between architecture and the arts?
Well, I would first say that I worked with Stephen on the Chiasma Museum. All the drawings that went to the construction site were drafted in my office, of course, on the basis of Stephen's sketches. But we were and we are still intimate friends, like brothers. I just add one more point to your description of art, his affinity with arts. In his bedroom, he has only poetry books. Well, architecture, in a way, the discussion on whether architecture is an art or not is maybe a bit useless, because we need to specify what kind of art architecture is, if it is an art. I would say architecture needs to be an art to express the relationality from which I began my introduction today. Architecture is such a complex interplay of often opposite aspects that it does not have a logical resolution. I almost would say, and I have said it, that architecture cannot have a theory. It can have theories, partial theories, but a comprehensive architectural theory is an impossibility because of the totally mixed contents of the notion of architecture. And it is also an art for the reason that Merleau-Ponty expresses in the sentence that I quoted. We go to see an artwork not because of the artwork, but because of the way how it reveals the world. And that also applies to architecture. Architecture is not the material building. It is not the engineering construction. It is all the images and feelings and perspectives and layered messages that it possesses, in the very same way as any art piece. There are architectural tasks which are almost purely engineering tasks, but even then, I would say that when they reach a high level, they must be considered art. I'm, for instance, now thinking of the early concrete bridges of the famous engineer. Now I forget his name. You know what I mean. Some of them are in Switzerland. So when thinking about the relation of art and architecture, we must set our mind and thinking in a specific way, which means we have to all the time remember the complexity of architecture as a phenomenon.
Yes, and here I would also like to pick up, because I also read your book on existential on the existential space in film, and this was a book that also impressed me very much, because the way you talk about film from the perspective of architecture also brings so many possibilities to the way we think about architecture and how we can design architecture spaces from this existential viewpoint. So I would also like to ask you, now that because at the same time you are also someone who, as you mentioned also in your talk, who criticizes the visual and also this overpresence of the image everywhere, and now everything, we are constantly overwhelmed with all these images, who become more and more seductive, because we also know how to manipulate these images better and better to make them as engaging as possible with the viewer. So I would like to hear your comment here on this, because also in a lot of our discussions that we have with the community of neuroscience and architecture, there's always this aspect of manipulation of the image or of the space to have a certain effect in the body and effect in the viewer, in the case of cinema. So where do we define the line or the limit, or in how far is there a difference between manipulation and between trying to create something which is deeper and connects more meaningfully to the human?
This idea of manipulation is quite important. One of my philosopher friends is or was the German philosopher who died a year ago, Gernot Böhme, whose last book is entitled The Critique of Aesthetic Capitalism. And his point in this book, I think, is very significant. He makes the point that in Marxist theory, production was motivated by need. But in societies of abundance, as we live in now in Europe and most of the Western countries, the needs have been fulfilled, but still the capitalist system of production needs to go on and keep growing. And that is possible only by manipulating the need. And that manipulation takes place by aestheticization, a deliberate aestheticization which ages products before their real use age, simply to give space for new products and the machine to keep on going. And unfortunately, architecture has also fallen into the same trap of expansion by image manipulation. Much of the celebrated architecture in the past couple of decades falls into this category of aesthetic manipulation. All significant and moving and meaningful art emerges from sincerity and whereas the manipulative attitude is the opposite of sincerity.
Yes, I'm very glad to hear your comment on this, because very often I try to introduce this topic also in different conversations and discussions, because we might not even be aware of it, because of course, for example, we know that Renaissance paintings, they had the whole idea of perspective was to guide the viewer to view a painting or a scene with a specific narrative, so to make it also to imprint and communicate a very specific message. And we also know that the whole mechanisms of propaganda that have been used specifically in the 20th century, that they also worked very effectively with this with this kind of brainwashing through the image. So, and often I wonder also if we are perhaps not going in that direction, and that's also something that concerned me. Do you think that there is a risk or a danger that what we know now about all this aspect of sensorial manipulation, that it can also be appropriated with this kind of intention?
Yes, absolutely, and it is part of the this situation that the system of production requires faster and faster exchange of products, and this is also now you can see this in architecture. But as a consequence of this constant novelty, invented novelty, architecture has become quite flat and superficial, and it doesn't move us. At least I'm not moved at all. I rather get angry. But true architecture always, because of its fundamentally existential message, it stops you, and it somehow disturbs you at the same time that it comforts you, and somehow supports your optimism about the world.
Thank you. I will now open the discussion to our students, because I don't want to take all the time. I would enjoy very much continuing with this, making the questions, but now you have a question? Maybe you can come to the, so we will take some questions here in the room, in the physical room, and then we will open also the questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for the inspiring things you said. I have a question about you mentioned that architecture is art, and also you talked about this aesthetic capitalism. If something is only made aestheticalized, can you say this?
Aestheticized.
Aestheticized. Is it then still art, or is this a contradiction? So does art end when it's only like within capitalistic intention?
Well, I have more and more related aesthetics or beauty with ethics. True beauty is always related or arises from existential echoes. It reverberates with human life and experience. That is why I have felt already 30 years that in architecture schools, we should not teach aesthetic styles or too much aesthetics, but the more fundamental existential and ethical concerns. And in my view, the focus of education should be on the individual student. Without the student becoming interested in herself and her relation with other people and the world at large, history, etc., etc., education of a creative person is almost useless or hopeless. What I am saying now turns away from aesthetics into something which is closer to the realities of life than a kind of a social game that aesthetics has become more and more nowadays, even in architecture. And what I'm saying is also reflected in a fact that the most powerful buildings are not necessarily so beautiful. They are also disturbing. They are very disturbing simply because they bring up some truth about human existence. Michelangelo's library in Florence, it is disturbing. It is truly disturbing, but I would say wonderfully disturbing, because at the same time that it confuses the visitor, it also gives hope and provides understanding. Architecture, when it is real architecture, it takes hold of us in a very deep manner, just as any other art form. But as I said earlier, today's standard architecture with a surface aestheticization, which is merely surface composition, does not touch us.
Do you see this with all architecture practice nowadays, or only like most architecture?
Well, we are all subject to our culture, and our culture in the Western world is completely guided by economy. Anything that really matters is money, which of course is a sickening fact. But yeah, an architecture which deals with rather huge amounts of capital, it has been drawn into this game of superficiality. So I would say normal practices are almost bound to be in this loop, and only the strong ones can resist to it.
Thank you. I had another question, but I forgot. So
maybe you can stay here, and if you remember, the next question. Here in the room? No? Okay, I think they need some time to, maybe in a few years they would remember, oh, this is the question I should have asked. Now you would have a chance, so you still have a few seconds. So I would like to open to the audience. If there are any questions, I didn't see any hands up yet, but you can, I think you can just go ahead if you have a question. Vinod Goel, please go ahead.
Thank you, Maria. Juhani, thank you for that talk. I really enjoyed it, and I agree with almost everything, but there was one sentence you uttered which I couldn't understand or make sense of, and it's possible that I simply misheard it. And that was, you're talking about the building and and the window, and you said the building pre-experienced and evaluated the landscape, sort of independent of us. Did I misunderstand that, or
Well,
could you maybe elaborate on it?
well, yes, I know that it was a bit vaguely formulated sentence myself. Of course, it has been the designer, the architect, who has observed the views and conditions and made the selections. But I just turned it as a quality of the building. But
in terms of the experience and evaluation, that's presumably the architect and the users, right? You're not saying there is something independent of that, or?
no, through the process, the process of design has chosen those details, and
Okay.
I often say that architecture is choreography. It's choreography of movement, but it's also choreography of sensing, and it's choreography of emotions. So I was referring to this choreographic quality of architecture, although I didn't use that word.
Oh, okay, no, that clarifies that. So I think with your shorthand way of speaking, I misunderstood that. No, that's fine. One other question, if I might. So your view on sort of arts and aesthetics comes from a particular sort of viewpoint, and I was just wondering, how do you react to people like Dennis Dunnett, who argue who make a case for art and beauty being sort of having a evolutionarily biological origin?
Yes. One of my special interests since I was 5 years old, has been animal life and animal constructions, and particularly more recently, beauty in animal life and constructions. And there are now biologists who are studying seriously aesthetic choice in animal behavior. And there is also one of the leading neuroscientists. This is how my 86 years old memory now.
Zeki, are you thinking of?
Pardon me?
Are you thinking of Zeki?
Zemir Zeki.
Yes, Zemir Zeki.
Zemir Zeki, yes. He says very pointedly in the beginning of one of his books, his most well-known book, that he has set as his goal to show that beauty has a biological origin. And I fully agree with that. That was also the point of the great poet, the Russian poet who moved to, or was obliged to move to America. It's too late here in Finland.
Okay.
Joseph Brodsky. Joseph Brodsky.
Brodsky, surely.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for this question, these two questions. Any more questions from the audience? We have a wonderful group here in the audience, so many people who came here to join us, including Vittorio Gallesi also, who is an New York. I don't know if he, David Navarrete has a question. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you, Maria, and thank you, Juhani, for the great talk. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak. I wanted to ask a question related to, just last week, we had an ACE meeting with the Center for Education at ANFA, and they mentioned eye tracking technology in terms of a group called Genetics by Design that is allowing people to basically evaluate the facade of a building by watching where their eye goes. And, you know, when you see the comparisons, you can see the classical buildings are more attractive than the modern ones. But it got me thinking, and this is a question for you, both Juhani and Maria, since you're both artists, in terms of the use, the potential perils and the potential opportunities of particularly artificial intelligence in making art. Because I was thinking, if you took this eye tracking technology to a museum and you saw a masterpiece that spoke very deeply to you, I don't think that eye tracking technology would be able to give you anything about why that moves you, and it wouldn't tell you anything about how to make that masterpiece. And now, in relation to the question that I have for both of you, and I'm going to put this in the chat, there was recently in the New York Times an artificial intelligence art piece that won the first prize at this art contest. And this was using this software that's called, I think, DALL-E, which basically can create an art piece based on keywords that you submit. And this particular software programmer basically created 80 iterations of saying, I want a Baroque painting, I want a circular window, I want a moody, you know, sultry environment. And the machine created, if you click on that link, that particular art piece. My question to you both is, when you look at that, is that really art, or does it move you? And if it does, and the machine can eventually create something that moves and stirs us deeply, I don't know, what does that say about the way that technology can be used to make architecture and art? It's kind of just an open question. I'm just curious about your thoughts.
Well, I am very critical of such developments, and also I totally disagree with the argumentation or suggestion that sort of mechanized or systematized processes could produce art, because art is meaning. It is human experience and meaning. Where would the computer get the human meaning? Human meaning is seeps through life experience, and not only a single life, but generations and centuries of human life. Art is rooted so deeply in the historicity of human culture that I cannot at all believe that this kind of quality of essence could be produced by anything else but human being, a special human being who has the capacity, who has developed the capacity and sensitivity to feel these layered realities in human mind and experience, and then is capable of projecting them in his or her artwork. I am rather negative about these things. At the same time, I want to say that my office, when I still had a running office, was 53 assistants, and each one of my assistants used computers. I didn't, and I would be a fool to say that computers are useless. They are utterly useful. but we should have the critical mind not to give computers qualities and possibilities which they absolutely do not have.
Thank you.
David, I would just, what could I add to this? Because I agree with most of what Juhani said. I would only say from my experience, because many years ago I was also interested in computation, and I also am interested in digital tools, and of course emotion measurement, and I also did a few experiments with eye tracking, and the eye tracking can mostly tell you where your visual attention is focused at. And I don't think it's very good at making predictions because of human variability. We pay attention to different things, but there seem to be some aspects which most of us pay attention to immediately. So eye tracking can be useful to kind of verify that. And about artificial intelligence, there's too much myth about artificial intelligence being able to produce things by itself, because there's no artificial intelligence without the contribution of the human. Algorithms are constructed by humans who painstakingly program them with knowledge, information, and whatever decisions the artificial intelligence is doing are decisions that were already somehow introduced by humans who spent a lot of time and thought in it. So I would also agree with Juhani that if an artificial intelligence would produce any architecture that would be remarkable, it was because the human behind it had something really valuable to contribute in it. So that would be my comments. I don't know, Juhani, if you would like to comment also a little bit more in this regard.
Well, as I already suggested a bit earlier, by aging, I have become more and more interested in biology and the living world. Those are such unbelievably complex things that nature reveals to us practically every day through sciences. I would rather believe in those processes and mechanisms than our technological inventions. And I think the defenselessness that we many of us have about or against advancing technology can also be frightening. I'm here thinking of, for instance, the study that young school-age children, 6 or 7 years old, have been studied, and it was found that their capacity to identify human faces and to read emotions on human faces has almost collapsed. So I would rather be on the side which wants to be a bit on how would I say, would be a bit hesitant of letting technology seep everywhere into our lives.
Thank you, Juhani. Do we have a question also from Adriana? And then we will have a question from Milton, which she sent me through the chat, and then we will finish the session. Adriana, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Also, thank you for this conversation and this inspiration. Talking about reality and dreaming, I thought of the Walt Disney method. And when it comes to creating and design of a mall or cafe, especially for a project in university, often I feel like I'm under pressure and my thoughts and creativity are like in a cage because of the expectations and of the professors and the restrictions that comes up with static and norms. Do you have any procedure or a suggestion, especially for students, to widen their thoughts when it comes to designing instead of feeling caught in requirements?
Well, I my advice or point would be that we all need to establish our personal world with our rules, ethical and existential and social and also aesthetic. I know what you are saying. I think we in schools of architecture we should teach resistance to these spreading fastly spreading false ideas. I have become more and more critical and resistant, I would say, myself to, for instance, the celebrated architecture today. In much of it, in my view and experience, there is very little to celebrate. There are more convincing buildings and projects which have never been published, which are closer to the true nature of human life and closer to the traditions. My feeling is that everything that has real meaning echoes with tradition, and every meaningful new idea somehow grows from tradition. I don't believe in invention in the artistic world. Invention is too focused and restricted and a phenomenon to be useful in arts, which have to somehow mediate total life experiences, as I said in my short talk before our conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I just think it's really hard because you learn throughout school, also in primary school and high school and university, that you have to do what taught you and what professors think that is good. And it's really hard to get over it because you still want to have that degree.
Yes. Well, I already said earlier that the focus in education in the creative fields should be on the individual.
Yeah.
We should, how would I say, massage the individual, the individual student to, have the strength to object to all the too easy invitations, which are given by books and journals and the newspaper fame.
Thanks.
Thank you. So Hanini, please, very quickly, because we need to finish soon.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful talk. I wanted to ask that you mentioned about art and architecture. So if architecture transcends to the realm of art, it also relates to the specificity of culture and shared beliefs among a community. So then this increasingly type of architecture which is seen, which is the global architecture, is this relevant, or should it be considered as a celebration of the common grounds of different cultures and backgrounds, and that is where we all unite, or should it just be considered as a disappointment for the lack of traditions and cultures which it doesn't serve? So, and do you think this is the only way forward?
I didn't hear you very well, but I'll try to answer. When I was a young student and architect, I believed in the universality of art. And I also believed in the universality of human values. When I was working in Africa during the Civil War, in fact, I changed my values and thinking fundamentally. We are all culture bound, specifically children of a distinct culture. And I do not believe in the possibility of mankind without tradition. Tradition is our foothold in time. We are all millions of years old, as I say to my students, because we are products of evolution. And we should be humble enough to accept these biological facts and also accept these realities in terms of time. I am not the only one who believes in tradition. Many literary scholars, art theorists, etc., and architects have written about the importance of the tradition. I, as a young man after the war in Finland, I believed in a culture that would free itself from traditions. But I soon realized that this is a very foolish and irresponsible idea altogether. We need traditions because traditions are our roots.
Thank you. Is there a question here?
Yes,
Okay.
or I wanted to share my thoughts because yesterday I was listening to an interview on YouTube with Peter Zumthor, and he was saying architecture invents rooms. So architecture invents rooms. So about inventing rooms. And this is something which really stayed with me because I also didn't quite agree that architecture invents necessarily. And I also didn't like really the wording because it's like, again, this functionalistic idea of this machine, which is invented. And yes, I wanted to share my thought because you say you don't believe that architecture invents or is inventing things. And this, yeah, it's, I also don't agree. Yeah.
Well, we reinvent what has been invented numerous times before, and this is tradition. Exactly, it is slow progress, but stable progress. As the biological processes, they are slow, but they are stable because everything meets the how would I say, acceptance of the mechanism of development. It is one of the, I would say, tragedies of contemporary architecture is that we are building new prototypes every single day, everywhere in the world, but there is no feedback. No feedback as to whether the ideas were meaningful and acceptable and beneficial or not. We just rush to the next prototype. Whereas in nature, all the prototypes are tested. And that is why, and only the workable prototypes continue the development of that species. I think we should, instead of thinking about aesthetics as a means of beautifying something, we should become more interested in evolution. There is also evolution in human culture and architecture and arts. We should more, I think, orient towards those processes than just simply rush to invent something new. I don't even understand what would be the value of that, except for the market.
Juhani, just a comment on this, maybe challenging a little bit this idea, because I had to think that, for example, with every avant-garde movement in art, and of course also in sequence in architecture, we had people who on purpose worked with tradition or with the language of tradition and subverted the language to create the avant-garde or to create something new, and then it was presented as new. But then again, they were building upon tradition to create something new. So even in the case of opposition, somehow the tradition is there. Would you like to make?
Yes. Well, artistic works can be as how would I say, they can hurt people's feelings as much as political ideas. You remember that the Rite of Spring, when it was first performed in 1904, there were street riots in Paris.
Yes, it was highly offensive. Yes. But I bring this because there's something in my soul that always makes me connect with such artistic manifestations. That's probably also because I got interested in, or the reason I got interested in performance art and also working with performance art in architecture. And actually, I have a Mona Lisa with a skull face today. So it's also kind of, so, and I am very connected to the work of Marcel Duchamp, who I think really did, we should have someone doing in architecture and arts, we should have someone like Marcel Duchamp also bringing some of this spirit, and not just to make profitable exhibitions. Juhani, I will just finish with a question that was left by Milton Schinberg. So he asked me to ask Juhani, how about Einfühlung or empathy, and how does this relate to the interaction between a human experiencing the environment, architecture setting, or natural?
I think that is one of the greatest talents of an architect is to have an empathic capacity. And it is fairly easy to differentiate a building whose designer has an empathic capacity from the one which is designed by an architect who doesn't have at all empathy. Empathy is simply feeling on behalf of the other. And architecture is naturally also seeing before the other, before the product even exists, and touching it and occupying the spaces, the rooms before the building even exists. So I would combine the word imagination with empathy, and I would place a very high value on empathic imagination. I think that is what an architect needs.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we have to finish for now. Thank you so much, Juhani, for being here with us today and for your contribution. Very grateful. It was very, as usual, very inspiring. And I hope that sometime in the future that we can meet in person again and continue our conversation. And thank you also to everyone who came here today and also for your time.
Good
Bye-bye.
night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye.